We're moving on to the second talk. We're still remaining in the same area in Asia, and the speaker of the next talk is Kevin Anchukaitis from the LDEO in Lamont. Please.
Well, let me just say thanks very much to Heinz for having me in this session and for letting me represent the tree ring lab at Lamont Doherty. I should say, is this going to work? No, that's okay. I should say I'm just one and a fairly recent member of what is a large team working on this project on the Asian monsoon, reconstruction of the Asian monsoon using tree rings, and attempting to cover the last 1,000 years or more. Over the last 5 years or so now, we have worked throughout Southeast Asia, building this network which you see here, and you can see right up through this last field season we've been adding chronologies, several hundred chronologies, and from more than, I believe, 45 countries, everywhere from Vietnam to the Philippines, Bhutan, Nepal, all those ones listed there, and many more. And our attempt has been to not simply do reconstructions of precipitation, drought, monsoon variability, but also to place this in the context of what is forcing or causing changes in the Asian monsoon. And we're particularly interested at timescales of decades or longer, trying to understand what could potentially be the cause for decadal scale variability in the monsoon system, decadal scale monsoon failure, and dry conditions in the Asian monsoon system. So what could cause this? And we're working generally in this framework that was outlined by Emil and Arblaster in several papers in 2003 here, and looking at these three main poles of this stool, if you will, that's supporting this monsoon system: the Asian land surface temperatures, tropical Pacific SSTs, and Indian Ocean SSTs. And I'm intimidated but happy to follow Axel Timmerman in a way, because he set out some of the really interesting parts of the tropical Pacific SST feature of this framework, and also I was happy to see that their unified ENSO reconstruction will look like the one I show in a little bit, which is a relief. So instead of trying to focus on this entire area, all these different proxies, all the different features of this quite extensive land area, I want to zoom in both in space and time at one particularly interesting feature. And it's interesting because it is a large-scale, decade or multi-decadal scale drought in Southeast Asia. And so what you can see here is 3 tree ring locations. One here by Masaki Sano and Brendan Buckley. This is a Phokenia site. Phokenia is a cypress, very long-lived cypress species. Here is a Mae Son teak site in Thailand. And then this is Bidup Nuiba National Park, also a Phokenia site. And those, the tree ring reconstructions of drought, in this case monsoon season drought, are arrayed in the bottom 3 panels here. And what you can see is this feature here. So this is an odd perspective, but right around 1750, what you see in all these is a move from generally wetter conditions throughout Southeast Asia to quite dry conditions that last a decade, and in the case of Bidup Nuiba in the southern part of Vietnam, even longer. They have very similar structure beyond that too. You see sort of a maximum wet period descends to one level of drought for several years, and then has another minima. And this is interesting from an additional point of view, which is that right around this time, this is by a book by Victor Lieberman talking about territorial consolidation in Asia, in mainland Asia, and it turns out right around this time that you have major civilizations in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in Laos and Cambodia essentially collapse. You have a major historical and human cultural reorganization right at the time that these droughts, or right following the time of these droughts. This is an interesting time period, both from climate and a human history point of view. Now, what could cause this? Well, there are some hints. This is from Dorigo et al. 2005. This is the Cook Nino 3 reconstruction. This uses tree rings from what we call the Tex-Mex region of North America, which is it's very ENSO sensitive and in a very stable way. And so these are good. This is a good proxy to use for reconstructing El Nino. And so there is a hint, sort of in the middle of the 18th century, of a period of colder Pacific SSTs followed by a period of warm SSTs, but it doesn't jump out at you. And so the answer doesn't lie here alone in this particular reconstruction of SSTs. Now, when we think of the canonical ENSO teleconnections to the monsoon region, we tend to think of this feature here that covers Indonesia into Australia. And this, in the sort of canonical view, we don't tend to think of Southeast Asia. But if you look at recent satellite-derived pictures of the El Nino minus La Nina composite, what you see is actually that Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand actually sit at this border between these negative anomalies, some of them quite strong, and opposite signed anomalies above that. And so this border right here, if it's at all dynamic, and it would be hard to believe that it's not, means that Southeast Asia really sits on the fulcrum for this particular teleconnection from ENSO to the monsoon region. Now, for decadal scale droughts, Miel and Hu in a nice paper in 2006, looking at the PCM climate model, identified this multi-decadal pattern, which they called the interdecadal Pacific oscillation, essentially a Pacific and Indian ocean-wide warming leads to wetter conditions over the southwest North America, dry conditions over the Asian monsoon region, and the opposite here for this cold swath of anomalies, decadal anomalies that go from the Indian Ocean through to the Pacific. And so this is another mechanism, potential mechanism, anchored in the tropics, anchored in the tropical Pacific and the Indian Ocean, that could potentially result in decadal scale drought in the Asian monsoon region. Now, the Indian Ocean is an interesting feature too, because for several reasons. One is that there's the Indian Ocean dipole, which I'll only touch on briefly. But then there's also this basin-wide warming, this Indian Ocean basin mode, and one way of thinking about this is as a capacitor, and this has been described in a couple papers here. But essentially, that the Indian Ocean basin mode allows the ENSO signal to be carried over past the spring barrier, if you will, and to affect directly the Southeast Asian monsoon. Also goes on to affect the Northwest Pacific anticyclone, and in some modeling simulations determines whether or not there is sort of a seesaw between a stronger South Asian and a weaker Southeast Asian monsoon, or vice versa. So this basin mode, in addition to the well-known Indian Ocean dipole mode, is a potentially important feature on its own, but also as a mechanism for communicating ENSO variability into the monsoon season itself. Now, the role of the Indian Ocean is somewhat complex and somewhat debated in influencing the monsoon. And partly it's because a lot of efforts at pinning down this relationship use the really long all India rainfall record. And in this nice paper by Becci and Harrison in 2004 in an AGU volume, what they showed is if you split the Indian rainfall region into these two boxes, you actually can get very different correlations with Indian Ocean SSTs. So that this northeast part of India, you have a negative correlation with southern tropical equatorial SSTs, whereas western India, southwestern India actually has positive correlations, so warmer SSTs, wetter monsoon. So this is a complex system, and it depends on the data and the time periods you look at, and it's not at all clear exactly how the Indian Ocean interacts to influence the monsoon. And I mentioned the dipole. As I'll show, we're not able to resolve this mode in the reconstruction of Indian Ocean SSTs I'm about to show. But what this does show is that colder SSTs around Indonesia result in drought, warmer, resulting in heavier rains over here, And this includes, in this graphic from Woods Hole, Southeast Asia as well. So one of my goals here was to apply reconstruction methods similar to the ones we use in tree rings to the reconstruction of Indian Ocean SSTs. And in particular, my target was this Indian Ocean basin mode during the monsoon season. This is the second mode. Unfortunately, we can't resolve it and have any sort of skill in reconstructing it. So all I'm going to be talking about today is this basin-wide mode. And we've restricted ourselves to corals that are available through the NOAA World Data Center and a few tropical tree ring chronologies. And the reason to do this is to try and keep our proxies that we're using for Asian monsoon precipitation and drought reconstruction separate from the proxies that we're using to do SSTs, so that we can actually independently start to talk about interactions between the two, and that there's no intermingling and interaction between the proxies, that we have true independence. Now, one challenge to using corals in this way was nicely laid out in this paper by Janice Lowe, and essentially pointing out that some of these records, including the ones that are integrated into our reconstruction, as I'll show you later, have trends that are inconsistent with local SSTs, that in particular that at longer time scales, longer trends, that the trends in local SSTs didn't match SSTs as they'd be derived from oxygen isotopes. And coral isotope records, like many proxies, are an expression of a multivariate environmental influence. And so this isn't necessarily a surprise, nor is it unique to any given proxy. It's just something we have to deal with. So my approach to dealing with it was to do this. If we don't trust, in this case, the trends that would be reconstructed in this method, or the variability longer than this period, and what we're interested in is these decadal, perhaps 2-decade-long droughts, we're just going to focus on that part of the record. So the reconstruction I'm showing you is concentrated in the annual to multi-decadal, but doesn't have centennial trends. And that's by design. That's so that we don't overfit with proxy predictors that have the proper trend. So our predictors are corals to tree ring chronologies, and this is an ensemble reconstruction. I won't get much into this, but essentially mixing and matching all the different choices that are made in doing a reconstruction. So which proxies are included, the methods of selecting proxies to go into your model, the calibration and validation periods. And so this just describes the reconstruction a bit more. I should say that Ensemble approaches to doing proxy reconstructions, quantitative proxy reconstructions, aren't new, and they're discussed and certainly before Berger and Kuschbach, but Martin Jukes has done this as well, and Martin Tingley and Peter Hubers have a nice talk tomorrow. Martin has a nice talk tomorrow on ensembles that emerge naturally from Bayesian approaches to field reconstruction. So let me show you these results. Up here is a plot of all the reconstructions that pass a minimum threshold of skill. So we use a low skill threshold just to allow as many possible and realistic ensembles into our reconstruction as possible. The red is the true, and the blue are all the different reconstructions, and somewhere around 1,000 of the 2,000 pass that minimum level of skill. You can express this in terms of probability, a probability density function that takes into account the uncertainty and the variance that's unaccounted for. And what you see is that up until about 1800, that you have a fairly tight uncertainty that arises from this ensemble. As you go back in time, the uncertainties are much larger. But there is, right around 1750, consistently here and here, this cold feature, what we can reconstruct as a cold feature, cold water, for about a decade during this period. So here, stacked together, are the median reconstruction from what I just showed you. Here's the Phokenia from northern Vietnam, the teak reconstruction from southern Vietnam. And then here are two reconstructions of ENSO, both of which Axel referred to in his talk. This is the Evans et al. Reconstruction of Pacific SSTs, and then this is the Cook reconstruction, an updated version of the one I showed you. So you have cold here corresponding to this drought. And then what is happening in the Pacific is that you go from cold just prior to that drought and switching to warm Pacific ENSO, El Nino-like conditions in both these reconstructions. And actually, I was noticing the unified reconstruction that was shown in the previous talk, and it also has this feature. I'll point out one more thing because I'm going to use it later, which is that a preliminary reconstruction of Indian monsoon rainfall, the regional rainfall that we've done as part of this project as well, also shows this drought here. It's not as severe as in Southeast Asia, but it has this sort of structured period of drought during the same period. So I'm going to use that information later. Now, could cold Indian Oceans have caused this drought in Southeast Asia? What I'm going to do is use this method for finding proxy model analogs, and that is climate model analogs. And Nick Graham has a paper in 2007 where he dubbed this the proxy surrogate reconstructions. It's essentially going into the space of the model and finding analogs, that is, finding time periods that appear like our reconstruction. So in this case, we're finding analogs for time periods where you have drought for a decade or so throughout Southeast Asia. And we want to see what conditions in the model produce that analog. There's other elegant ways of doing this using optimal model selection in these two papers here. And then Nick describes this technique quite well in his 2007 paper. Sorry, so the model we'll use is Kasper Ammann's long millennial run of the CSM 1.4. I don't have time to go too much into it, but here's the details, and the results are described in Kasper's 2007 paper in Proceedings. Just to give you an idea of what these analogs look like, so these are drought analogs from the CSM 1.4 for decade-long droughts in Southeast Asia. So brown colors are dry or negative PDSI values, Palmer Drought Severity Index values. Green is wet conditions. And what you see is that if we just select the analog based on Southeast Asia, you get always get dry Southeast Asia, but sometimes you get a wet, say, Western India. Sometimes you get a very dry Australia. Sometimes you get a moderately dry Australia. So the proxies are being selected, or excuse me, the analogs are being selected in that way. So what's causing this? If we look at the SSTs that are associated with the analogs just for Southeast Asia, what we see is this warm pan-Pacific pattern, warm throughout the equatorial Pacific, but also a bit warmer in the extratropics. And then this pattern of colder SSTs here in the Indian Ocean, in the tropical Indian Ocean, equatorial Indian Ocean. Actually warmer here, and that seems to be because the Indian Ocean, several of those analogs have wet Western Indias, and so that's associated with that. So if we then select analogs so that you also have that dry India that we infer from the Indian monsoon region reconstruction I showed briefly, this is what you see. The SST pattern is a bit more muted, but it's the same, and it's actually a bit more concentrated in the equatorial region. These anomalies are a bit too far west compared to real life, but you're looking at ENSO type patterns here, and then colder conditions throughout the Indian Ocean. So consistent with what we found from the reconstruction of Indian Ocean SSTs as well as the existing El Nino reconstructions. I'll skip over that one slide, but just to point out some of the challenges to doing proxy surrogate reconstructions. There are questions about whether the model represents major climate modes properly, whether those climate modes are teleconnected as they are in the real world to terrestrial climate. This is only a single model. Other models might do something different. And there are complications of the modern era, so analogs that occur during the modern era tend to have anthropogenically forced features that may not be representative of the past. And then there's this issue of which analogs do you choose. The distance metric used to find proxy analogs tends to vary smoothly, and so you have to find a threshold, and that's a non-trivial and poorly constrained process at the moment. And so my conclusions are this, that this region-wide Southeast Asia drought in the middle of the 18th century may have been caused by a warm Pacific and a cool Indian Ocean. that's consistent with both multiple proxies of SSTs as well as our terrestrial drought reconstructions, and it's consistent with the model analogs, as I've shown, and within the limits and the caveats I suggested there are. So thanks very much.